Hello, everyone, and welcome to Africa Fire Mission's weekly virtual training session. My name's Mike. I'm a project coordinator here with Africa Fire Mission. We're so happy you guys took all the time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's training. Today, we're joined by Tim Nutbeam. He's going to be talking about extrication of patients from vehicles. We're really excited to have him here teaching with us today. If you guys stick around for at least 70% of today's training, which is usually about 40 or 45 minutes, you can receive a certificate of attendance for today's training. After we complete today's training, we'll pass it over to Jose, who's Africa Fire Mission's fire safety advocate, for some tea time. I invite you all to join us for that as well. Before we get started with today's training, I'm going to pass it over to Jose. He's going to give us a few words of encouragement.
Thank you so much, Chief Mike. I truly appreciate you. Thank you, Mr. Tim Nutbeam, for honoring coming today. You are joined from a big family from all over Africa and also outside Africa in the UAE. So everybody, welcome. So my encouragement of today is really short. Last week was a very busy week for African firefighters. The Malawi firefighters went to put out fires in one of the estates in Malawi. And as they were doing the job, one of their operators was thrown a rock at, and they had to get out from that place very fast. Just last week also, actually this week, firefighters in Kenya, in an area called Mathare, were thrown stones at. And it got me thinking, what goes through your mind when those guys get to throw rocks at you and you've come to help them? And one Bible verse came into my mind from James chapter 1 verse 2 to 4. It says, when you face trials of any kind and challenges, there's a reason to that. There's a reason to why you're going through that. You don't need to give up and say that this job I'm not going to do anymore. What you need to do is to just get into your quiet situation and ask God, hey, what is your plan for me? And it is up to you people now to go on the ground and get moving, either in fire prevention or even talking to the local leaders in your area. Thank you so much for listening to the encouragement of the day. Back to you, Chief Mike.
Thank you, Jose. We always appreciate you taking your time to be with us today and those words of encouragement. Before we get started with our training, one last reminder, keep your eyes in the chat. I'll be posting a link to our Google Drive where you can get materials from today's training. You can rewatch today's video. If you get cut off or you don't have enough time to complete it today live with us, you can go there, complete the video, and answer a few questions, and you'll receive a certificate of attendance for that training or any of the other trainings we've done previously this year. So go ahead and check that out later on down in the chat, please. At this point in time, I'm going to pass it over to Tim and let him begin with today's lesson. Go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm really happy to have the invitation, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of the work that we've done. I'm very conscious that this work is work that's been done in the UK, and I'd be really glad to learn what you think the African context is. I've spent just over a year of my life working in Southern Africa, in South Africa and in Botswana, and I've got some experience of working alongside the fire and rescue services and EMS services there, and I'd love to come back and spend some more time. I'm hoping you can see my screen, and I'll work my way through this presentation. So my background is I'm a doctor. I'm trained in emergency medicine and pre-hospital emergency medicine, and I spend some of my time working as a professor of pre-hospital critical care, so running research and trials and those sorts of things. I spend some of my time working in a busy, big emergency department where I've got responsibility for major trauma. And I spend some of my time working on a helicopter-based EMS service, looking after a rural area of the UK. I'm very lucky to benefit from all those different ways of working and different perspectives. And I've had an interest in extrication for since around about 2006. So quite a few years now, and I've done quite a lot of work in relation to extrication. The project I'm going to talk to you about today is one which we've called the Exit Project. And it's all about applying scientific ideas to an area which was kind of unexplored in terms of this interaction between where the EMS have responsibility and fire and rescue services have responsibility, and working out how we can look after our patients the very best that we can do in that area. And some of the research that we're going to talk about today has been sponsored by the Road Safety Trust, which is a UK-based charity, and they take money from speed cameras and they use it to fund research to improve patient outcomes following motor vehicle collisions. So that's I think a really worthy cause. So what are we talking about? We're going to talk about these sorts of incidents. So an incident where a patient has been involved in a motor vehicle collision, there's been a transfer of energy, and the patient is trapped following that incident. And kind of over the last years, we've seen this change an awful lot, and we've seen the approach to these sorts of patients change a lot. And I've really benefited from attending fire and rescue courses and being trained as an extricator, attending as a member of the EMS team, and also seeing things from perspective of someone who coordinates a response to major trauma. And what I noticed was that a real mismatch between the approach that we were taking on scene, which was an approach which took a lot of time, so cutting a car apart carefully in order to minimize patient movement, and what I was seeing in the hospital, which was a very low rate of spinal injury, a very low rate of spinal cord injury specifically, and actually lots of very significant time-dependent injuries like head injuries and chest injuries and abdominal injuries associated with bleeding. And there seemed to be a mismatch. There seemed to be a mismatch between the approach that we took on scene and the approach that we saw and the injuries that we were seeing in the hospital. And as a result of this mismatch, it appeared that people were dying. And I'm sure you've all experienced patients who've died in your care whilst trapped in their vehicle. I'm sure you've all experienced patients who've died in your care whilst you've been transferring them to hospital. And that's why this is important. And if we can do something to minimize that chance of death, that risk of death, then it's something that we should take seriously. So what are we going to talk a little bit about today? So we're going to talk about the current approach to extrication, the history, so how motor vehicles and extrication have evolved hand in hand, and talk about some evidence, so evidence from the literature, if you like, so what's already out there and published, and new evidence that our team here has generated, and then hopefully come up with some take-home messages or some useful messages. Once again, I'm really conscious that I'm normally speaking to people in the UK and in other higher income countries, and talking about how this will translate well into the African setting. I'd really benefit from your ideas and perspectives. I'm really keen to learn. So what happens in a road traffic collision or a motor vehicle collision? So there's different transfers of energy at each stage of the motor vehicle collision, and this transfer of energy will help you predict injury. So the first thing that happens is the car hits another car, it hits a tree, and the patient comes to an abrupt stop. Then, if safety systems are being utilised, so things like seatbelts, or there's airbags, or there's central safety zones, there'll be an interaction between the patient and those. And if those aren't present, there'll be an interaction between the patients. The patient will hit their steering wheel, or they'll hit their windscreen, and there'll be a transfer of energy there. And then the third and often overlooked transfer of energy is the shearing force, which is applied to the patient at this side. And it's the organs and the different bits of the brains moving against each other. And that can cause significant injury as well. So you've got the initial stop, the interaction with the patient, and if they're ejected, it would be the road furniture. If they hit the inside of their it might be them hitting their steering wheel, or it might be them interacting with their safety systems. And then finally, the body system, as the body comes to a stop, there's this shearing force that's applied, and that can cause significant injury as well. So how we understand injury is an interaction between three different things, and it's really important that we have to understand each of these things in order to understand what's happening to our patients. And the three things are kinematics, so that's the transfer of energy. The energy is involved in what's happening, and you'll see this if you're on a really fast road. The chances are there's big forces involved. If a car's rolled over several times, the chances are that there's big forces involved. If the car's come to, is in a slow bit of the city and has come to a gentle stop, the chances are that the smaller forces involved. So the number one predictor of injury is the kinematics, so the amount of force that's involved. The second, and I appreciate this is different in different parts of Africa, is the availability of safety systems and, of course, their utilization. So safety systems do work, they do reduce morbidity and mortality, but they have to be used effectively. So you've got the kinematics, and then you've got the, if you like, the positive effect of the safety systems. And then the third thing is the tissue tolerance of the patient themselves. So this is the amount of energy that needs to be overcome in order to cause injury. So if you imagine you've got a very old person and they're 70 years old and they're very frail, if they get involved in a motor vehicle collision, their tissue tolerance is very low. But if you have someone who's young and fit and well and very healthy, their tissue tolerance is much higher. So they can take a much bigger force before it causes major injury. Whereas that older person or that frailer person or that small child only needs a small amount of force in order to cause major injury. And so when you approach a motor vehicle, if you think about the kinematics, how much force has been involved? If you have a look at the safety systems, were they used and were they appropriate? So that's things like seat belts and airbags. And then what about my individual patient? What's their tissue tolerance likely to be? And by understanding all three, you can get a really good idea of what injuries your patient in front of you might have. And if you can judge their injuries, then you can work out what treatment they might need and how quickly they might need their treatment. So road traffic collisions are now the leading cause of death in people between the ages of 5 and 25 years of age across the world. So motor vehicle collisions, are a major killer. And they kill 1.3 million people a year, but also hospitalized between 20 and 50 million people who will have long-term disability as a result. So this is a massive issue that needs attention and care. And the extrication phase of rescue is really important. So we can't do much in our jobs, in our roles, about that initial transfer of energy. We can't do much about making people use safety systems. We can encourage them to do them. We can encourage, but once that energy transfer has occurred, there's not much we can do. And there's not much we can do about how frail our patients are or what their tissue tolerance might be, but we can do something about the extrication phase. And we know that by doing it well, we can reduce mortality, so that's the risk of death, and reduce morbidity, so that's the risk of long-term injury. And we know it's really important in this first phase of injury. So in the first 4 hours of injury, this is a critical time where getting things right will make a difference to our patients. So why is extrication important? So this will be different in different setups, and I appreciate there's people on the call from a wide range of countries which will have EMS systems at different stages of development. But at the point that an injury occurs or an accident occurs, then there's not much you can do about your response time. You might have a car, you might have a helicopter, you might be close, you might be far away, but there's not much that you can do about it. And the same between where the car accident is and what the best local hospital is and where you're going to take them. You can't make new hospitals appear. But what you can do is do something about the scene time. And we know that if you're bleeding to death or you have a brain injury or you have a chest injury, that a prolonged scene time leads to a poor outcome. And that poor outcome is often death. So if we can do something to change that on-scene time, to change the time from injury to meaningful life-saving intervention, then we will save lives. And that's why extrication is important. So what is happening? And me and Mike were exchanging a few words around this before we started today. And in most places in the world, fire and rescue personnel are trained in approach which is directed towards absolute movement minimization. So there is a fear that primary spinal injury, so injury caused at the time of collision to the spinal cord, will get made much worse by movement, and that by applying certain extrication techniques that we can minimize that movement, and that will minimize harm to the spinal cord. And so as a result, we train very hard and we train very carefully. And I'm not too sure how much these techniques are used in your area, but when I was training, we'd put a glass of water on the dashboard of the car and we would cut the car apart around the patient. And if we spilt the glass, then we failed the training. And that's the attention to detail in terms of movement minimization. The problem is that movement minimization takes time, and time isn't something that these patients necessarily have. And we know this is UK data and it's kind of being extrapolated to elsewhere, that the average extrication time is around about 32 minutes. And that might not seem like a long amount of time, but if you're bleeding to death, that 32 minutes can mean a difference between being dead and being alive. And so it's a really important time and something that needs focus. So historically, this is how we used to do things. Absolute movement minimization, lots and lots of collars, firefighters holding people's heads whilst they're being extricated, and we were trying to minimize movement to try and preserve the spinal cord. Now, I'm going to talk to you briefly about the research project that we did to challenge some of these assumptions and hopefully give you some guidance onto how things may be done in a different way, which might be better for our patients. So when you're considering science, there's different ways of doing that. And one way that we use commonly in clinical medicine is something called evidence-based medicine. And that means making sure that we've got the right scientific evidence, that we've got what our patients want. So we know what our patients want in terms of their outcomes and how they're dealt with. And then using experts to take that information and transfer it into policy or procedure or documents that guide practice so that we get it right. And we use this structure when we were planning our research to make sure we considered each of these elements in turn. I'll go through this in detail because it's a bit complicated, but we'll pick on each of these bits in turn. So we first looked at what evidence was available, and we did that through something called a systematic scoping review. Sorry. And what you do in this is you go and you speak to librarians and you speak to people who've got access to lots of data, and you ask them to show you what they've got. And we looked at over 7,000 different references. So it was fire manuals from the 1950s and 1960s, government reviews, procedure training manuals, medical papers, and many, many thousands of these papers that were identified by librarians as being important. And we looked at these to try and work out how extrication had evolved over time. And we found, as you'd expect, that with motor vehicles came collisions, and with collisions came trapped people, and with trapped people came extrication. And you can map the development of extrication alongside the development and the utilization of the motor vehicle. And we see in the late 1870s, so many, many years ago, we see cars coming onto the roads in the UK. And then we see what we'd initially call informal rescue. So that might be by passers-by, it might be by the police service, it might be by taxi drivers, it might be by mechanics. And I know that's still the status quo, what happens in some parts of the world now. And then since this is in the UK, since the 1970s, we see more and more involvement of rescue services, and particularly of firefighters, and them having it becoming their job, they're becoming their statutory responsibility to get people out of cars following motor vehicle collisions. Also in the 1970s, we see the first pneumatic hydraulic rescue tools being developed, and Holmatro, which is a company which makes these tools, patent the jaws of life in 1971. And then once again, it's from a UK and US and Australian perspective mainly. We see a really interesting thing happen now, and we see a movement from all injuries being considered equal when it came to extrication. So head injuries and chest injuries and abdominal injuries, and then occasionally a spinal injury, to a different focus. And we see an absolute focus on spinal cord injury, and perhaps to the detriment of other injuries. So we see a movement from let's focus on all the injuries to an absolute focus on the spinal injuries and movement minimization. And as a result, a whole load of new people became trapped. So entrapment where you work might be that the car has changed shape in order to keep someone inside. But now we have people who are trapped just because they've got a sore neck and they get the car cut around from them. Or we get people trapped because they might have a spinal cord injury, even though we've got no evidence of such, and they have the car cut around from them. And as a result, we get lots more people being trapped, and lots more utilization of extrication tools. What was really interesting to me is that our evidence showed that there's been there's never been any evidence for how we extricate. No one has ever said, these are the injuries, and therefore we should extricate this way. It's always been through handing down information from firefighter to firefighter, or the development of new ideas, but there's been no scientific or medical evidence to prove that those ideas are the right way to extricate, or that movement minimization is the right approach to take. And this paper on the screen now is one of the oldest papers that are confined from 1968, which described the rate of spinal cord injury in patients who've died as a result of motor vehicle collisions. And the rate of spinal cord injury in this paper from 250 subjects was less than 1%. So out of all those patients who died, they died of head injury, they died of chest injury, they died of abdominal injury, but the rate of spinal cord injury was very low. And I'm going to show you data which shows that it's still low today, and it's very low compared to other injuries like head injury. So this is a take-home message. So previous extrication strategies don't have a scientific basis. So they've evolved through hearsay and what we think might be best rather than what we know might be best. So the next thing we did is we looked, as I said, we looked at those 7,000 papers, and then we identified what gaps. What did we need to know? What new things did we need to know in order to add value in this area? And we performed a number of different studies. And if you've got a phone with a QR reader, when you're watching this back on video, you can download all of these studies. They're free and open access. So these are, once again, they are UK-based studies, but I can show you at the end how we're using similar data in African countries to show that the theory is the same and the data and the injury patterns are the same. So this was a study of 60,000 road traffic collisions. And we looked at patients who were trapped, and we looked at patients who weren't trapped. And we worked out what people's injuries were, what their risk of death was. We looked at how much blood they received, what medical procedures they received, whether they lived, whether they died, how long they spent in hospital. And we found a few really interesting things. So we found that if you were trapped, you were much more likely to die. So almost twice as likely to die if you were trapped. And that difference held even once you took into account lots of different things. So once you matched people for injuries, or matched people for age, or matched people for type of injury, we still found that entrapment did something that killed you. So being trapped is bad, it kills you. And that means that we can do something about that to make less chance of being dead. We also found that spinal cord injuries, the rate of spinal cord injury in trapped patients was relatively low. So many of them had head injuries, many of them had chest injuries, many of them had abdominal injuries, but the rate with spinal cord injury was 0.7%. So that meant the other 99.3% didn't have a spinal cord injury. And even out of those patients with spinal cord injury who might benefit from movement minimization, who might benefit, over half of them had another time-dependent injury like a major head injury. The final finding from this data was that many patients looked very similar. So often when there's a clinician and a firefighter at a scene, we will talk about how quickly does the patient need to come out. And we will do that based on how the patient looks, perhaps what their heart rate is, perhaps what their blood pressure is, perhaps what their respiratory rate is. And what we found is outside of the really sick patients, those who were going to die quickly were very hard to distinguish from those who didn't die. And it was really difficult to say that a patient was stable and could have a prolonged extrication, because many of the patients had normal looking clinical observations, but went on to die very quickly. So this idea that a patient is stable is probably a false paradigm, and one that we need to try and overcome, because it just doesn't hold true. Patients who look well can become sick very quickly. This is another study now, and this was about age. So we looked at different ages of patients and worked out if patients had the same type of injury, and worked out if we should be extricating them differently as a result. And what we found is that the injury pattern was very similar, independent of the decade of life. But older people with minor injuries were very much more likely to die than younger people with minor injuries, with moderate level of injuries. So that probably doesn't surprise you. Older people have a lesser tissue tolerance, and older people have less capacity to get over an injury, and therefore are much more likely to die. But what we did find is that the injury patterns were similar. So even though spinal cord injuries were slightly higher in older patients, they were actually very similar across all age groups. The final study in this series looked at the difference between males and females. And we did find some really interesting differences between trapped females and trapped males. So females were much more likely to be trapped, particularly at a younger age. Some of this is to do with car design. Some of this is to do with mechanism of injury and impact. Some of it is due to biological factors, like the female pelvis is probably more prone to injury. And we did find some slight differences in injury patterns, with females more likely to have pelvic and spinal injuries when compared to males. And it was difficult to account for that from mechanism of injury alone, but we did show that females were much more likely to have a side impact RTC, and men were much more likely to have a front impact RTC. So what were the take-home messages from this first bundle of research? So previous extrication strategies weren't based on scientific evidence. They evolved and have never really been tested until now. Trapped patients were much more likely to die. The rate of spinal cord injury was low in the trapped patient population. Clinical observations, so things like the pulse and the respiratory rate, were falsely reassuring. Most patients did not have injuries which prevent self-extrication, so might be able to self-extricate. And there are small differences in outcomes with age, big differences in outcomes with age, small differences in injury pattern, and biological sex does lead to different injury patterns as well. I said that we'd have some African context. So this is a piece of work that we're doing at the moment using a data set called the Global Burden of Disease. And this is looking at the rate of spinal cord injury compared to total injury as a result of motor vehicle collision. And it's important to note that these injuries are all from survivors. So it doesn't talk about those that die pre-hospitally or immediately following the collision. But what we did find is that as a percentage of total injuries, and this chart looks very much the same when you look at it as a percentage of total of major head injury, that the rate of spinal cord injuries was very low. So the rate of spinal cord injuries you can see here is between 1 and 1.6%, with the highest rates probably in countries like Ukraine and Canada. But in countries like most of Africa, you're between around about 1 and 1.5% rate of spinal cord injury in your injured population. So that means that the other 98% of patients have other major injuries. So they have head injuries, and they have chest injuries, and they have abdominal injuries, because that's the pattern of injuries that we see with motor vehicle collisions. And the rate of spinal cord injury is low, and therefore we need to think about the harm and balance of our approach to these patients. So we can extricate them very, very carefully and very, very slowly. And that might benefit 0.5% of patients. Might, and I'll tell you why it won't in a bit, but it might benefit 0.5% of patients. But the rest of the patients, they're going to have other injuries which are likely to be time dependent. And we need to think about how we look after them as well. And this slow and prolonged extrication strategy isn't going to help them. So, moving on. So now we're going to talk a little bit about biomechanical analysis. So what we did is we tested how extrication techniques worked in real life. So we took healthy volunteers, males, females, different sexes, different weights, different heights, different ages between 20 years old and 70 years old. And we extricated them using techniques which you'll be familiar with. So we extricated them using rapid extrication techniques. We extricated them using slower techniques where you take the roof off or you cut the side off the car. And we found some really interesting things. So I'll show you first a kind of a video of how we did this data. So these people, you cover them in biomechanical sensors effectively. It's the same sort of technology they use for motion capture for video games. And then as a result of all these sensors, you can build up these 3D pictures. And once you've done these 3D pictures like this, you can then take measurements from these pictures and see the amount of movement that's going on. So you can see this is a patient self-extricating. They're just climbing out of the car themselves. But what we can do is we can take measurements from this. We can look at the amount of movement that happens at the spine, at different levels of the spine and in different parts of the body as well. So, and this is a patient, the same sort of thing, but this patient is having a roof-off type extrication. So someone's winding down the seat, they're sliding in the spinal board, a backboard underneath them, and they're being gently lifted up that backboard. And they're being lifted there. You can see their legs just coming free of the footwell. And once again, we can take measurements of what's happening at the spine for each of these movements to see what's going on. So we did quite a lot of work in using these models. So we looked at the benefits of having a collar, so a cervical spine collar on, and whether it reduced movement or not. And we found that it did reduce movement, but it only reduced movement by a bit, and it might not be that it reduced movement by enough. And we did demonstrate that cumulative movement, so actually putting the collar on a patient, caused quite a bit of movement in itself. So you don't necessarily need collars in order to extricate someone safely. And if they're not available, they can still be extricated very safely indeed. We then looked at different extrication techniques. So we looked at a roof-off technique that you can see here, where you cut the A post, the B post, and the C post, and the roof goes away. And then you lift the patient out, as you can see here. We looked at a B post rip, where you take away the main B post of the car to create yourself space and bring out the patient sideways. And we looked at this rapid technique, which doesn't involve any tools, but involves the spinal board and then rotating a patient through 90 degrees from their position in the car seat onto the board. And we analysed movement during each of these techniques. And we did these techniques hundreds and hundreds of times, so we could see across different patients and across different males and females and people of different weights what we could find. And effectively, we found that all the extrication techniques, whether they were fast techniques or whether they were slow techniques, all cause the same amount of movement at the spine. So whether it be a snatch rescue or whether it be a slow roof-off type technique, which takes 30 minutes, we found that the amount of movement at the cervical spine, if we think that's important, we found the amount of movement was about the same. And you can see here that all of those movements in millimeters are around between 5 and 6 millimeters of movement. What we found, and this was a very, very consistent result, was that self-extrication caused lots and lots, about half the amount of movement of any other extrication technique. So if you do want to minimize spinal movement for your patient, the very best thing you can do is get them to move for themselves. So get them to step out the car themselves if they can, ride them an arm to lean on if that's the right thing for them. We're not talking about dragging patients out of cars. That's a different set of movements entirely. But gentle patient handling and gentle support causes less movement than the techniques that we think cause less movement. So I think this is really important because this shows us two things from this research. So one, the rate of spinal cord injury is very, very low. And we should be thinking not just about the spinal cord injured patients, but all the other patients as well. And two, the techniques that we've developed over the years, over the last 60 years to try and minimize spinal movement don't actually work. And the techniques which are meant to cause minimum spinal movement cause the most spinal movement, and techniques which are meant to cause the most spinal movement cause the minimal spinal movement. So the very best thing you can do is create enough space and then ask the patient with your assistance to get out of the car themselves. So we also did different types of extrication, such as chain cabling extrication, where you put a weight on your A post and your C post and you stretch the car apart. And we tried many other different techniques, but we found effectively that all extrication techniques cause about the same amount of movement, apart from self-extrication, which causes about half the amount of movement of other techniques. So there's lots of take-home messages. So I'm just going to pick up on the last ones here. So collars do reduce movement during extrication, but the clinical importance of the collar is unclear, and we're talking about cervical spine collars. Self-extrication, so asking a patient to step out of the car themselves, causes the least movement of all extrication techniques. And all the other extrication techniques, whether they're very quick techniques like a snatch rescue or a crash rescue, or a slower roof-off type rescue, all caused about the same amount of movement. And therefore, if they're equal in terms of movement, you need to consider them in terms of time. So if a patient does need an assisted rescue, then you should probably choose the one which is going to be quickest, which is probably going to be a snatch rescue, because it causes about the same amount of movement as one of the more prolonged extrication techniques. So that's looking at the yellow box that we've kind of boxed off now, which is the relevant scientific evidence. And the next thing that we did is we interviewed patients who've been injured in motor vehicle collisions, and we asked them what their extrication experience was like. So we got a qualified psychologist to interview them and ask them what would have made their extrication experience better and what factors made their extrication experience worse. And what we found is that patients really benefited from someone in the car with them explaining what was happening in terms that they could understand. So they understood what was happening and how people were trying to help them. And when people got these explanations and understood what was happening, they had a positive experience. And when people weren't spoken to and didn't understand what was happening, it was incredibly scary for them, and they had a really bad experience. There's also lots of stuff around people really didn't like having their photos on social media. They really didn't like people videoing the wrecks. They didn't like to see that later down the line. So do think about that in terms of your kind of when you're using social media at the scenes of these wrecks. So what we found is that patients really valued communication. This is lesson number 10, and they really valued having a dedicated extrication buddy. So that was someone in the car with them, ideally holding their hand, telling them what was going on, explaining everything for them as they're being rescued. So the last study that we're going to talk about is this one, and this is where we kind of brought all the new information that we had together. So once again, this is a UK-based study and probably needs repeating in an African context. We're providing some of the data to help that to happen at the moment. So we asked our College of Paramedics, who are responsible for EMS in our country. We asked our National Fire Chiefs Council, who are responsible for fire and rescue in our country, and then various other research and fire and rescue organisations to help us to take all this data and come up with some practical take-homes for how we should extricate patients in the UK from now on. And effectively, that's what we did. So when you do a Delphi study, all of these people, they vote and they read the evidence and they interact anonymously from each other, so no one knows what the other one is doing. And at the end, you get a number of statements that are being voted on. If you're going to have a look at one paper, if you've got the opportunity, I really encourage you to have a read of this. Just click on the QR code with your phone. And we found consensus effectively. And this consensus, we then worked with this group of stakeholders to convert it into a set of statements. And those statements have now become national level guidance in the UK. So they tell our firefighters what to do and how to approach an extrication, and they tell our paramedics, our EMS services, what to do and how to approach an extrication. And that means that everyone's speaking the same language. So what are key take-homes? So the key take-homes for this is that all patients with evidence of injury should be considered time-dependent, and their entrapment time should be minimized. So this was an outcome from this multidisciplinary expert group. So if you've got evidence of injury, you should come out quick. That was the one of the primary findings. And the second primary finding is that self-extrication should be offered as an extrication technique to all patients who might be able to self-extricate before any other extrication technique is tried. So we've demonstrated very clearly that self-extrication is superior because it's quicker and it also is safer for patients. So moving ahead, lots and lots of unanswered questions, and we're working on those questions now. So we're looking at some of the biomechanics of someone who is physically trapped, the car has changed shape around them. We're looking at what we should be doing in vehicle, so what we should do before the patient is released in terms of clinical intervention, which might make a difference. And I suspect that's going to be things like painkillers, analgesia, in order to make their extrication experience more favourable. But I don't think it's going to be anything too complicated at all. We're doing a piece of work around tranexamic acid, which is an injectable drug, which makes a difference to your clotting and means that you're perhaps less likely to die from bleeding. And we're looking at also how we reliably identify patients with injuries and without injuries. And that's firefighters reliably identifying injuries. So there's a whole piece of follow-on work following this initial exit project, which help us to kind of work through this and take it to the next steps. So I suppose in summary, what have we done? So I'm a trained clinician, I'm a scientist by background, and have been trained in research techniques. And these techniques haven't before been applied to this particular area of practice. And I think that's because it's evolved over time as people have learnt about how to use tools and refined how they've used the tools, but no one's considered it from a scientific perspective. So this bundle of work, we've considered it from a scientific perspective and realized that a lot of what we thought to be true isn't true. And a lot of what we thought we were doing well, we actually weren't doing so well at. And things that we thought we were doing badly, we were doing well at. So take-home messages, the rate of spinal cord injury is very low. The rate of other injuries is high. Extrication techniques don't perform as we thought they did. And we've done this with different extrication groups in different parts of the country, different expert extrication groups, championship winning extrication groups. And there are differences, but the differences is small, and no one can perform an extrication as well as a self-extrication. And we've demonstrated that very, very clearly. There's lots more work to do in this area, but we're really excited what's happened so far. And we're really excited we've been able to change national guidance in the UK. And we can already see the rate of because we've got national level data in the UK around types of extrication. We've seen the rate of roof-off type extrications plummet, effectively come down very quickly. And as a result, entrapment times have decreased. And we're pretty confident that that will show improvement in patient outcomes over time as well. This is the end of my my talk. I hope you found it interesting. I really benefit from the questions that people ask, because we really benefit from people's different perspectives from all walks of life, and I really look forward to benefiting from those. And thank you for giving me your time today.
Awesome, thank you, Tim. I'm going to get things started with the questions for you. So you've determined that self-extrication is what we prefer. So my question would be, what's that next step then? So here in the US, in the past few years, we've gotten to the point where we've been using the collar and the backboard quite extensively, to the point where if there's been a mechanism of injury and the patient is self-extricated, sometimes they'll apply the collar and the backboard standing and then place the patient into the ambulance.
Rapid takedown, yeah.
So what's that next step? When based on the evidence that you found, what's the next step? Do you utilize the backboard like that? Do you try to get that collar on, or what's that next step as we're doing the transport?
So patients who are fully conscious, so we'd say a GCS of 15 out of 15, we wouldn't immobilize those patients anymore. So someone who is fully conscious so your neck muscles in your neck, if you make them all stand out, these are the best collar that you've got. They will hold your neck in. The body is designed to look after you when you've got an injury. When those neck muscles are working effectively when you're conscious, they will do a better job than any collar, and they will hold your neck in a position that is good for your spine if you do have an injury. The rate of innocuous spinal injury, which leads to long-term damage, is extremely, extremely low. But we have seen a lot of harm from unnecessary immobilization, both individual harm, so it affects your ability to breathe, to take a deep breath in, and many of these patients have chest injuries. It affects your physiology. Lying flat isn't particularly good for you, and being unable to rock from side to side. So there are lots of negatives of immobilization, that's on an individual level. On a system level, it leads to excess costs, excess transportation, excess use of imaging, and all the costs of insurance and all the stuff which comes with that as well. So in the UK, if you've got a GCS, so if you're fully conscious, GCS 15 out of 15, then you wouldn't be immobilized. You would only be immobilized if you had a lower GCS and we didn't think that you could control your spine. I work for an air ambulance unit. I can't remember the last time we used a collar.
Fascinating. So looking into your crystal ball in the future, is the C collar going to be redesigned so that you can apply it if necessary without causing more damage than we're doing right now?
I think we will see instead more liberal protocols, which means so if you look, the Norwegians don't use cervical spine collars at all. Australia has moved pretty much across to soft collars. The whole kind of Germanic Anglo-Franco system have moved to a very, very directed use of collars, so they're only using them on unconscious patients. So I think we'll see them using less and less rather than a redesign to make them work better. If you look at a collar, if you look at the instructions on it, it's described as an extrication device. It's not described as an immobilization device. It doesn't work as an immobilization device. If you're going to use it at all, an unconscious patient, I'd put a collar on to extricate them, and I'd take the collar off as soon as they're on a flat surface, because we know that they do cause damage. They cause decreased cerebral perfusion. They cause increased cerebral pressure. The harms probably outweigh the benefits in many, many patients.
Excellent. So the piece that goes with that, I think, for a lot of our folks in Africa is going to be sort of that public education component of trying to get the public. We see that a lot. If there's an accident and someone's trapped in that vehicle, that you've got the public just sort of grabbing those people and yanking them out of the vehicle quickly. So we always want to emphasize that public education, not to do that, but it's okay to help someone out, sort of gently help them out. Very good. Awesome.
I think that's the really difficult balance, isn't it? I think in a lot of higher income countries, we've paralyzed our bystanders and said, don't touch them because you might make a spinal cord injury worse. And that's certainly in American guidance and Canadian guidance and current UK bystander guidance is, no, get them to look ahead, don't touch them, you might make a cord injury worse. And I think that is, our research group think that's caused more harm than benefit. On the other side of the coin, and there's lots of data in this from India and Pakistan, in low middle income countries, there's people being dragged out of cars very vigorously and very unconscientiously, and that probably causes harm as well, and that's not a nice thing to happen to you. And probably the median is in the middle. Middle is gentle patient handling, supporting patients as you can do, assisting them gently from the vehicle, and that's the message here. The message isn't don't worry about the neck, drag them out. The message is patients benefit from gentle patient handling and patients benefit from generating their own movements. And I think that's true whether it be a spinal cord injury that you're worried about, or whether you're worried about a rib injury or an injured liver. Being handled gently is really nice. Being dragged isn't nice. It causes pain and probably causes excess injury.
Awesome. This is really great stuff. At this point in time, I want to open up the floor to any questions that any of our participants have. You can raise your hand. You can put a question in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Any of those options. If anybody's got any questions, go ahead there. Looks like in the chat, I got to somebody else had the same question I had there, so that's good. That's really encouraging, the sort of, not having access to a lot of cervical collars in some of the areas that we see serving in Africa. It's so that should be encouraging that you don't necessarily need those in order to provide quality patient care. That's a really good takeaway.
Yeah, the only patients we're using collars on now are patients with massive max fax injuries who've broken their jaws to try and hold their jaws up so you can get their way in. But we're pretty much never using them for neck injury, apart from the extrication phase. Like occasionally we have to get someone out of a submarine or an oil tunnel or something like that, and they need a collar as they come up vertically to stop their head rolling forwards. But that's the only time that we're using them. So I wouldn't worry too much about collar sizing and those sorts of things. I would I think we're seeing the communities move on beyond that.
Yeah, so there you see a question in the chat from Errol talking about how to measure and place the collar. But I think sort of the message here is that we don't need to focus on that collar so much if the person is has some tone and condition in that neck that they can hold themselves up, they're going to be all right. Looks like, and would you say a soft collar would be better than a hard collar if you're going to use a collar, or?
So the Australians have adopted soft collars because they think they cause they're less harmful. I think it's important that difference between patients who have got a neck injury and patients who will benefit from a collar. So many patients who are involved in road traffic collisions will have a minor or a moderate neck injury, but just because you've got a neck injury doesn't mean that you will benefit from it. And that's important to separate out those two things. And some of them will benefit from a soft collar because it makes them feel better, but biomechanically it doesn't do a huge amount.
All right. In the chat, we've got a question. What's the first step to take when you arrive where a patient's trapped? What's the essential step?
So there's many essential steps. So the first is to check that you're safe. So we do see, so most vehicles, if they're going to set on fire immediately. So you're normally safe, but you do need to bear that in mind, delayed combustion. You do need to bear in mind dangers from the highway, and ideally you want the highway being shut or at least space in which to work. Once you know that the vehicle is safe to approach, and the highway is safe, you're going to, I think, approach the patient. And at that point, I'd offer some reassurance. I'd say, my name's Tim. I'm here to look after you. I'm going to do my very best to look after you. And that tells you a couple of things. If the patient responds to you, that's a good thing. I normally ask them to do something really simple at that stage. So perhaps give me a thumbs up or to wind their window down. And that to me is a really good initial risk stratification. If they can give me a thumbs up, it means that their brain is working, their spinal cord is working, they're able to understand instructions, and they're probably in a low risk. And if someone can give you a thumbs up, they can probably step out of their vehicle. So we've got a screening tool that we use to see if someone can self-extricate. It's called You Step Out, but it's effectively, does the patient understand? Can they move both their legs? we create space for them to get out, and then we I'll bring it up on the screen if I can do, and then we ask them to step out of the vehicle, and we'll do that before we ask them to do anything clinical, because we know that a clinical assessment is much better if it's done outside the vehicle and gives us much better information. I'll just share that now. You might be able to see it. So that's checking that the patient understands first. Can you see that on the screen, or?
No, we're just seeing you.
Oh, let me try again. Share.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. So this is a tool which is designed for use by rescue personnel. So the U is check that the patient understands. The S is support. So that's reassuring the patient. And we know that many patients will have a very traumatic time following a motor vehicle collision, and that initial communication does make a difference to that. The T is to try moving. So we ask them to move both their legs back and forth. And effectively then we plan their egress and plan them to get out. So that's making sure they've got space, that it's made it safe for them to step out, and that they've got somewhere to go. So that's kind of like my very initial approach, because many patients following a motor vehicle collision don't have any major injury. They can step out of their car, and then we can stand down resource, we can clear off and go and have our cups of tea, or we can go on to the next job where we needed. If they're majorly injured, it's a different set of principles and a different approach. But the approach is to still get them out of the car as quickly as possible, because we know that in-car care is generally, in-car assessment is ineffective, and in-car care should be kept to an absolute minimum. So I would aim to relieve entrapment as rapidly as possible and get the patient to a place where we can assess them properly and we can deliver any interventions that they need. I know in the past, and I've certainly been guilty of this, I've done all sorts of exciting things to patients whilst they're still trapped, whether it be airways or blood transfusions or cutting holes in them to let air out or whatever it might be. Now we've moved across to absolute minimal intervention, whether that be through cutting or relieving of entrapment to get a patient out. And I know you've done a lot of work around what I term minimally invasive extrication techniques. So the use of power tools, the use of bolt cutters, the use of domestic power tools to extricate patients quickly. And I've seen those in expert hands, and you can get someone out just as quickly with those tools as you can with expensive, difficult to find hydraulic tools.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim, for all that knowledge you're passing on. At this point in time, we're going to wrap up sort of the formal portion of our training. We'll get to some more questions in just a few moments, but I want to thank Tim for coming and sharing that really a valuable lesson today. Some really fascinating information that's new to me, even here in the US. So some really great information there available. Thank you all for coming and participating today as well. Check your emails for your certificate of attendance. They'll be coming out to you sometime within the next week here. Appreciate all you taking the time out of your schedules and joining us here today. We hope to see you all again next week.